Hello Year 12, welcome to your second chronological topic, which is on the emergence of the Crusader States and the settlement in Outremer. So we're going to do the first lesson for this. We're probably going to be able to get through about half of this particular chronological topic before the break for summer, and we'll start this up again when we're back in September, hopefully. So today we're going to be looking at why Jerusalem emerged as the dominant Crusader state following the events of the First Crusade. So think First Crusade, it's successful for the Franks. We almost stopped it with the capture of Jerusalem in June of 1099. We now need to see what happens to these areas that they've conquered and try and get a bit more of a geographical understanding about the Holy Lands. So that's our job for today. We're going to outline the geography, the economy, and the rule of the four Crusader states. We're going to explain why Jerusalem emerged as the primary Crusader states, and if we can, and it might be one of these things that we actually go back to when we're going through it thematically, we'll look at maybe how the above points had an effect on the Frankish settlers of the 12th century. For the purposes of today, we're going really up from about 1100, or really actually technically 1098, up until 1143, when we have a significant fighting force under an Islamic leader called Zengi, who starts to push against the Holy Lands, and that really is the start of something which we'll look at as the next topic, which is the Second Crusade. So we're going to go up until about 1143 today. I've given you a booklet as well. I'd recommend that you have a look at that. Most important thing in that is a page map, which is quite detailed, and that can be useful for whenever you hear the name of a place and you're a bit unsure about, you can always just refer back to it. The Internet Medieval Source Book is still very good. I would recommend having a look on there. What I'm suggesting that you do is watching these videos, but at the same time you do still have that expectation of reading around the subject area and finding out more about it. For this particular chronological topic, the Edexcel textbook, which is by Davis, Taylor and Blair, which is the Conquest, Control and Resistance in the Medieval World, is good. This is specifically designed for your topic, so obviously it is going to be helpful, but their third chapter is very usefully laid out for this particular chronological topic. The other textbook, which I recommended before, the one on Byrom and Riley, is very good at giving you a background knowledge of the Crusader states and how well assimilated Franks and Muslims and Jews and other ethnic groups in the Holy Lands were, but doesn't necessarily help us with the topics that we need to cover for the Edexcel specification. So I would recommend having a look at the Conquest, Control and Resistance book. So you do have this map. This is the one that I've just referred to. I would make sure that you have this in front of you whilst we're going through today's notes. Whilst I'm going through this particular the piece of information, you've got four different pieces of paper. I would recommend that you take notes as you're watching and listening. And if you've got further time for research and you want to go and find out a little bit more, then I would suggest that you do so. But remember, the end goal is to try and think about why Jerusalem, the state which is at the very bottom here, so the one that's in blue, why this particular area becomes the primary Crusader state, and the other four of Tripoli, Antioch and Edessa, why they're perhaps left in the wake and why they're not as well protected. So that's essentially what I want you to cover. The same things apply for each one. So how was it conquered by the Franks? That's a little bit of a revision exercise to go over things of the First Crusade. Significant events, and I want you to expand on them because I'm only going to give you very basic details for each one. And then the geography and the significance, which is the most important topic for today. So what do we know about this specific area? What was significant about it? So let's start off with Edessa. Now, Edessa was mentioned when you did your reading for the First Crusade, and we mentioned that in early 1098 there's a split of the crusading forces, and two different figures, one of them being Baldwin of Boulogne, set out away from the rest of the army. The other person, Tancred, he'll come back and we'll mention him again shortly. But Baldwin of Boulogne, who's the younger brother of Godfrey of Boulogne, split from the rest of the crusading army. We think that he was probably just in search of fame and land and fortune, but there's been suggestions that he was in a partnership with Emperor Alexius I, who wanted Edessa to become part of the Byzantine Empire again. Baldwin and really a small number of knights, we think between 80 and 100, marched east, and they defeated Seljuk Turks on their way. Now, for this relative size of them, this was quite an achievement. And in March of 1098, they were able to capture the city of Edessa from the Seljuk Turks. Now, Edessa is in present-day Turkey. It's on the border of Syria. It was a wealthy town, and it was mainly populated by Christians. But these Christians were part of the Eastern Church, and they're called Christian Armenians. So these Armenians saw what Baldwin had done. They were so impressed by his tactics that we think they got rid of their own Christian Armenian leader, and they replaced him with Baldwin. Baldwin married the daughter of that Armenian leader, a lady called Ada, and that cemented his alliance. Because he was a Count of Verdun in France, in his homeland, he gave himself that same title. So he saw himself as a Count of Edessa, and this is the first proclaimed count of this new area. Now, in terms of geography and significance, we'll go to that next, because it might be particularly helpful to do it in that order, rather than looking at significant events first. Edessa is by far the largest area at its peak, but it's the smallest in terms of population of all the Crusader states. The reason why is because lots of these areas are essentially inhospitable in large numbers. That it borders into desert areas. It's actually, around these particular parts of Edessa are where quite a lot of conflict has taken place over the past 10 years or so, involving groups like the so-called Islamic State, and previously before that, other insurgent groups in northern Iraq. And the reason why it's quite a place where it's difficult to fortify is because there are large swathes of inhospitable territory. For the county of Edessa, it's mainly centralised around two fortified cities, one being Edessa and one being Tebessel. Now, both of these have a largely Christian Armenian demographic, so they're not that diverse in their makeup, but the rural areas, so the rural settlements, are of different ethnic groupings. They're not necessarily as well Christians, but they're not necessarily groups that are going to rise up against the Count of Edessa. And it's mainly concentrated around the Euphrates River, which has got large fertile lands where agriculture can take place. And you can see in your map, it flows north. So if you have a look here, that's where the Euphrates goes. The thing that Edessa doesn't have, which is quite significant, is it has no major rivers that flow into the Mediterranean, and it has no coastal settlements. Now, that means that it's difficult to continually supply. It means that Frankish settlers don't really go to Edessa to settle, and as a result, the population doesn't expand by settlers, and it isn't largely reinforced. Because of its geographical position as well, it's vulnerable to attacks from the east. So in this particular direction of the east, you've got the major Islamic centre of Mosul, which is in modern-day Iraq, and Mosul is an area where the Fatimid Empire is going to have a lot of support. Or sorry, I think Abbasid Empire, not the Fatimid Empire. And the Seljuk Turks are essentially concentrated there. So the first territory that they would get to would be Edessa. In the south as well, you've got the town of Aleppo. On this map, it just says Alep because it's in a different language. But Aleppo to the south as well is another fortified city under Muslim control in the 12th century. So it's not necessarily well fortified in terms of its borders. It doesn't have a wall that goes around this. And as you can see from that map, the areas in which the Count of Edessa controls varies, and really to say that it's that kind of area of territory is not necessarily true. The Count of Edessa might say that they control the lands all the way up until this particular point, all the way to Amid, but in reality these are large areas where nobody is living, and really we can say that the main area of the Count of Edessa is what they originally had in 1098, 1099, which is around Edessa and Tebessel. In terms of significant events for Edessa, in 1100, Baldwin I, the count who we just mentioned, Baldwin of Boulogne, he's actually chosen to be the king of Jerusalem. They see his successes in Edessa, and with the death of his older brother Godfrey, he's decided to be the king of Jerusalem. So it's a bit of a step up for him, and obviously he takes that particular promotion, and he's replaced by a man called Baldwin of Bourg, who's no relation, even though he's got the exact same name, and he then becomes Count Baldwin II of Edessa. 4 years into his reign as Count, Count Baldwin II is captured at the Battle of Haran, and it leads to this problem of succession and regency that lasts for about 10 years or so. There's this person I've mentioned already called Tancred de Hauteville. He's regent of Antioch, and he tries to rule Edessa at the same time. And even though Baldwin II's captured, he still sees himself as ruler, so it's undermining his position. By 1118, Count Jocelyn I becomes Count of Edessa. We then have, by 1131, Count Jocelyn II becomes Count of Edessa. And you can find out more about these people if you want to get some more specific details about what their experiences as counts were. I would suggest that. But really, the reason why I've said today that we're stopping at 1143 is because of an event that takes place in Edessa. So in 1143, the city of Edessa is captured by the forces of the Islamic leader Zengi, and this starts this second crusade. So in terms of those significant events, those are the major points, but I would like you to do some research and just find out a little bit more about Baldwin II, Jocelyn I and Jocelyn II as well. The second state that we're going to look at now is the state of Antioch. So this is to the west of Edessa. We've mentioned the siege of Antioch before, and you've looked at that when you were studying the First Crusade and doing some independent work on that. That lengthy siege of Antioch is culminated in its capture and its acquisition by Bohemond of Taranto, who becomes the Prince of Antioch. Now, when everybody else, all the other Crusaders, leave in January 1099 to conquer Jerusalem, Bohemond decides to stay. He decides that this is where he wants to begin a principality. Now, a principality means that he wouldn't hold allegiance to any other territory. So unlike the County of Edessa, who would swore fealty to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, so a bit like a baron and a king, the Prince of Antioch doesn't want that. The Prince of Antioch wants a certain degree of independence. But his decision to do that leads to problems. It leads to problems in terms of his borders, and it also leads to problems because as a prince, he's going to be undermined by the Byzantine Emperor to the north and to the King of Jerusalem to the south. In terms of significant events, Bohemond is immediately imprisoned. So within a year of becoming Prince of Antioch, he's imprisoned, he's captured, and Tancred, who we've mentioned already, takes over as regent. Now, Bohemond is imprisoned, and then there's a period of exile as well. He dies in 1111, and he's succeeded by his infant son Bohemond II, who can't rule. So clearly Tancred carries on as regent. When Tancred dies, only a year later, another regent is selected. That's Roger of Salerno. So these are predominantly the Italian contingent of the crusading Frankish forces. But Roger himself dies 7 years later at the Battle of the Field of Blood, which is an incredibly bloody conflict, hence the name of the Field of Blood. And that really hinders the protection of Antioch. And as a consequence, the regent between 1119 and 1126 or so is the King of Jerusalem himself. And the King of Jerusalem goes to support the Prince of Antioch because at this particular point Bohemond II is too young to rule. In 1126, Bohemond II finally arrives into Antioch. So he's been Prince of Antioch since really he was very young, but he hasn't arrived until he's a young man in 1126, and he immediately swears fealty to the King of Jerusalem. But unfortunately, again, he dies 4 years later in battle, and there's a succession crisis that follows because there's no male issue. The King of Jerusalem doesn't want a woman leading the territory of Principality of Antioch, and we have this scenario whereby 1136 we have marriages whereby the person who's married into the family becomes the Prince of Antioch, so not necessarily by blood. And again, what I would suggest that you do is you do your research, find out a little bit more about these particular individuals and these stimulus points as well. In terms of geography and significance, Antioch is different to Edessa in the fact that it has a coast, and even though the major city is Antioch, an important area is St. Simon or St. Simeon, which is a coastal settlement close to Antioch that can be heavily supplied. Now that means that support from troops in Italy or from the west and from the rest of the Frankish states, and also trade can be supplied there, and then it can supply Antioch as well. The problem of the princes of Antioch is that they perhaps had delusions of grandeur. We don't know exactly what they wanted. Did they want to work with the Byzantine Empire, or did they want to try and take territories from that? And in the northern part of the Principality of Antioch and into southern Anatolia, we do see conflict not just with the Seljuk Turks, but also with the Byzantines. But at the same time, we then have them swearing fealty and loyalty to the Byzantine Empire as well. And to the south as well, they've had to rely on the Kingdom of Jerusalem probably on about 15 separate occasions. It's not necessarily a particularly well defendable area. It's quite vulnerable in the fact that Antioch is very close to the Muslim inhabited city of Aleppo, as we mentioned already. So Aleppo obviously causes problems for the county of Edessa, but it also is causing problems for the Principality of Antioch, and the failure to take Aleppo by the princes of Antioch is something that's a consistent thorn in their sides. To the south as well are a series of mountains that I'll mention when we talk about our next area, the County of Tripoli, but they also have a bit of a problem for the territories within Antioch as well. So to summarise, in terms of its significance, yes, it has a coastal area, so that's important for trade and it's important for supplies. But the problem of Antioch is that it's sandwiched between so many different either enemies or areas that are going to cause them problems. So the Byzantine Empire, the Muslims concentrated around Aleppo, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem as well. The third area that we're going to look at, the Third Crusader State, is the County of Tripoli. Now, the County of Tripoli is unusual in the fact that it was established after the capture of Jerusalem. So we're kind of going from north to south in this particular study, but actually if we were doing it chronologically, Tripoli would be our last Crusader state to look at. Because when the siege of Antioch ended in January of 1099 and the remaining Crusader armies marched on Jerusalem, they bypassed the County of Tripoli. That wasn't their original target. Now, Raymond of Toulouse, who we've come across before, he takes a number of his forces after the conquest of Jerusalem and goes to the major port cities on the Mediterranean coast, so Tortosa, Gibelet, and finally the most significant one of Tripoli. Now, this takes a while. It's not something that's particularly quick, so really we can't say that the county is established until about 1109. Raymond, what he does is he establishes a vassal state to Jerusalem. So that means that he would swear fealty and swear loyalty to the King of Jerusalem. So the King of Jerusalem essentially can tell the County of Tripoli what to do, very much the same as the County of Edessa. But Raymond does hold independent ambitions, and he's not afraid at various different times to go against the view of the King of Jerusalem. There's a good example, for example, in 1131 and King Fulk of Jerusalem. So if you are interested, you can find out a bit more about that. In terms of significant events, then, as I've already alluded to, it takes a long time to establish this particular county. In 1102, the county is very, very small, and it's centred around the capture of the city of Tortosa, and that's really done in 1101. But what happens in 1102 is that Raymond of Toulouse decides that he's going to be called the master of Tortosa in 1102. So that's really when we think the County of Tripoli starts. But in 1109, when he captures the city of Tripoli, then we know that this is the general boundaries of this particular county. But in that same year, we have the death of Raymond of Toulouse, and there's a bit of a succession crisis between Raymond's eldest son and his cousin. Essentially, Bertrand, emerges victorious, and his son, Bertrand's son, succeeds to the position of count in 1112, and he leads a successful 25-year reign as Count of Tripoli until 1137, when he's murdered. And if you are interested, I would suggest that you look into Pons. He's killed in Damascus. He's quite a formidable figure, and he's a very independently minded figure as well. He's not necessarily going to bow to the will of the King of Jerusalem. So again, as with the previous two states, have a look at perhaps Pons as an individual and see what you can note down as part of your significant events. In terms of geography and significance, well, I mentioned this when I was talking about Antioch. Tripoli and Antioch are essentially share a border, with Tripoli being to the south, but sandwiched in between them are the Nasari Mountains. And the Nasari Mountains are where a group of, almost like a sect of Islamic warriors that originated from Persia have concentrated on, and we call these assassins. Now, you'll obviously know what that word, you'll have heard that before. The assassins were a military order, a military sect, not necessarily a military order, a military sect that had castles, that raided into certain areas, and actually are a constant thorn in the side for the state of Tripoli. In actual fact, in 1152, which is after the topic that we're looking at, when we look at the Second Crusade, we'll go into this in a bit more detail, but the assassins actually assassinate the Count of Tripoli in 1152. Now, with Tripoli as well, it does have access to the coast as well, which means that it's well supplied. It does have trade, and compared to the other two states that we've looked at so far, it's compact. That does mean as well that there's less territory to defend, and it does mean as well that they're not being too ambitious. I mean, it has to be compact by its surrounding areas, but Tripoli doesn't necessarily see the same problems that we see with Edessa and Antioch, but it is still a vassal state, and it is something that is still it needs to gain the support of the Kingdom of Jerusalem if it is to make severe attempts on certain castles or outlying territories. And so finally we come to the most important of the four Crusader states, and we're looking at the Kingdom of Jerusalem, not the Principality, not the county, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Now, its first ruler, Godfrey of Bouillon or Boulogne, he's only really the leader. He doesn't crown himself as king at that particular point, but he's only around for a year. He dies pretty soon after the actual settlement of Jerusalem in the first place. And his younger brother Baldwin, who's Count of Edessa, is selected as the new king of Jerusalem. So Baldwin moves from Edessa and becomes king on Christmas Day in 1100. Now, the kingdom, it moves over time, and there's, again, territories which are conquered. There are certain states which are never conquered. There are certain areas that take a long time to conquer, so for example Ascalon, but the kingdom generally comprises of the territories that you can see on your map, and the ones to note of real importance are the 5 cities of Jerusalem, Acre, Tyre, Jaffa and Tiberias. Those are the 5 most important cities in this area, and they're generally centered around the Sea of Galilee and the Mediterranean coast. The very south of Jerusalem as well, we have the Fatimid Empire of the Egyptians, which is going to cause problems in the next 50 years. It's the most populous of the Crusader states by far, and it's the most diverse in its ethnicity as well. Now, in terms of significant events, Baldwin I, who was Count of Edessa and ends up becoming the first king of Jerusalem, reigns for 18 years. So we've got some stability there, which we haven't necessarily seen in some of the other states, perhaps with the exception of Tripoli. Baldwin II, no relation, succeeds him, and he's been the Count of Edessa before, if you remember. So the Count of Edessa, in both occasions, becomes the King of Jerusalem. Now, Baldwin II has no male issue, and as a consequence, his daughter succeeds him. Now, that causes quite a lot of ire, and this continues into the 12th century. We have this a number of other times. And she rules with her husband, Count Fulk. So Count Fulk essentially is King of Jerusalem. You know, this is a very misogynistic, patriarchal time of well, it still is, I suppose, but in the 11th century and the 12th century in particular, the idea of a woman ruling the crusading states was almost taboo. Now Count Fulk rules up until 1143, which is the date in which we're stopping our activities, because that's when Edessa is captured, and it just so happens that Count Fulk dies at that same time. Now, with the other Crusader states, I would suggest that you do your own research, find out a bit more about Baldwin's reign, Baldwin II's reign, and also Count Fulk as well, and his relationship with his wife, because Count Fulk wasn't necessarily King of Jerusalem by blood. But we're going to concentrate more on the geography and significance of this particular Crusader state. Now, Acre and Tyre are significant trading ports, and when we come back in the autumn term and we go through this thematically, we'll talk about the settlement of states. And Acre and Tyre are quite significant because they're significant ports in their own right, but they're important for certain trade routes, so particularly sugar and spices, and that means that there is an incredible amount of wealth around Acre and Tyre. This particular Crusader state is the home of the major sites of pilgrimage, and we've already discussed which ones those are, but just to go through them again, it's the site of the True Cross, the relic of the True Cross. It's in Jerusalem's home to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. You've also got the Church of the Nativity, which is in Bethlehem. This is where the vast majority of pilgrims from Europe will be travelling to, and because they've secured some of these important trading ports, so things like Jaffa and Acre and Tyre, it's going to be easier for the pilgrims to arrive over the course of the next 50 years. So Jerusalem becomes more heavily settled compared to the other Crusader states. It's also home to the Patriarchate, which is the religious home of the Crusader state. So the Patriarchate is the area of the Christian control that's under the control of a patriarch. So it's almost a bit like a pope. The two patriarchates are in Jerusalem and Antioch, but the most significant is in Jerusalem as well. So from a significance perspective, religiously, the Crusader states are centered around the Kingdom of Jerusalem. What's quite interesting about how they set up the kingdom in the first place is they rule it not from a centralized position. Godfrey understood this before, in the short time that he was ruler of Jerusalem, and Baldwin I significantly understands that in order for him to successfully consolidate these areas, he needs to establish a vassal state. It needs to be a case where he doesn't rule from a centralized area and think that he can have all of the control. So what he does is he gets different people that were crusading knights or senior crusading figures in the First Crusade, and he establishes counts. So, for example, there is a Count of Tiberias, for example, and actually we'll note the famous Count of Tiberias later when we look at the beginning of the Third Crusade. Now, these counts, we can give them a general title of Marcher Lords, and you'll recognise that phrase because we used that when we looked at the Anglo-Norman Kingdom and the marches of Wales in England and Scotland in England. And marches essentially mean that these are areas where there is going to be fighting between two opposing forces. So these lords had a military responsibility to defend the kingdom itself. Now, what he did is he gave them areas of control as well, and he gave them a certain degree of autonomy, and those are called fiefs. It's very similar to what we were looking at with the Anglo-Norman Kingdom. But the most important areas for the king, the ones that hold maybe a geopolitical significance or religious significance, or just political significance in itself, they were kept as part of the royal domain. And those particular areas like Jerusalem and Acre those weren't given to a martial law. They were kept under the control of the King of Jerusalem themselves. There were still sites of importance for Islam, and actually we do see, and this is something that you can find out more in the Byram and Riley book, about the idea of assimilation in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So for example, we've got Samaritans, Eastern Christians like Armenians, Franks, Jews, Druzes, Arab Muslims, Bedouin tribesmen. There's lots of different ethnic groupings that live within the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And there's evidence, for example, of converted mosques that were shared by Christians and Muslims in the city of Acre. So it'd be interesting if you wanted to do some further research, and particularly the Byram and Riley book will give you the answers on this, about how well assimilated the Kingdom of Jerusalem was. So today was a brief overview about these 4 particular states, so that you've got them, and you can start using them quite confidently when we talk about the events that lead up to the Second Crusade. Look at castles, look at the military orders. But for the end of today, after you've taken your notes on those 4 pieces of paper, I want you to think about these 2 questions. Firstly, why do you think Jerusalem emerged as the primary crusading state? There's this phrase of the primacy of Jerusalem. So why did it emerge as the most significant crusading state? And try and make sure that your answer includes 5 different arguments for that particular case. So 5 separate reasons. The second one is a bit tricky, and it's optional. You don't have to do it, but it would be a good exercise for you. So with a clean slate, imagine it's 1100, no territories drawn. What would have been the most effective way to establish and defend the Crusader states? Was it right to have the County of Edessa remain as they were? And perhaps it might be a useful exercise for you to think of this as the King of Jerusalem. So if maybe you're King of Jerusalem in 1100, how would you maybe redraw the map to make sure that the Crusader states were effectively defended? That will get you to critically engage with the territories that of the Holy Lands, but also of the surrounding areas as well. Now, next week, what I'd like to do is I'd like to have a Teams meeting to discuss specifically the Crusades. I'll send out an invite for that. This will be separate to our coursework meeting, and it's likely going to be the case that this will be next Thursday. So as part of that, I'm going to have a few of these questions. I'm going to get people to contribute, so make sure that you're ready for that. If you've got any questions that you'd like to go through as part of that Teams meeting, just let me know. It will take place in the morning, so it doesn't interfere with any of the drop-in sessions that you may be attending. Thanks very much for watching again, and any questions, just drop me an email.